Hey everyone, tonight we are going back. We have got a child in a 1950s household learning, in real time, that there is a correct way to hold a fork and an incorrect way, and that the incorrect way will be discussed at length. We have got the story of Emily Post, the woman who turned American manners into something very close to a national religion and somehow made the whole project feel like a kindness rather than a threat. We have got an afternoon inside the life of a 1950s etiquette teacher, a woman who stood at the front of a church basement or a school gymnasium and tried to explain to 40 restless children why their elbows were not welcome at the table. And we have got a closer look at what all of this etiquette instruction was really doing underneath the surface, who it was actually for, who it protected, and what it quietly kept in place. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable. Maybe pull a blanket up and let's go back together. It begins before you are fully awake. Not the etiquette itself, not yet, but the awareness that something is expected of you. It is a Saturday morning in 1953, or maybe 1956, somewhere in those steady middle years of the decade when everything in the magazines looked clean and purposeful and slightly too bright. You are 8 years old, or perhaps 9, and you're lying in a bed that smells of ivory soap and the faint mineral warmth of wool blankets, and there is a sound coming from downstairs that means the day has already started without you. The sound of a skillet on a gas burner, the sound of your mother's shoes on linoleum, and somewhere underneath those sounds, the quiet structure of a morning that has rules, and those rules have already been in place for longer than you have been alive. You sit up slowly. The bedroom is cool in the way that October bedrooms are cool. Not cold enough to be uncomfortable, just cool enough to make the blanket feel like something worth mourning. You reach for your clothes because your mother has already told you, twice, that pajamas are not for the kitchen table, and that breakfast is not something you attend in whatever condition you happen to wake up in. You get dressed. You run a comb through your hair, not because you care about your hair, but because the alternative is a specific kind of silence from your mother that is somehow louder than anything she could actually say. You come downstairs. The kitchen is warm and smells of coffee and of something frying, and the table is already set, not elaborately, not with the good china that lives in the cabinet and is not for ordinary Saturdays but properly. Napkins folded, glasses in place, everything at the right distance from the edge of the table. You know, without being told, that you are to wash your hands before you sit down. You have known this for as long as you can remember. It is not a rule that gets explained anymore. It is simply part of what a morning is. You wash your hands at the kitchen sink using the soap that is always in the same place, and you dry them on the hand towel, not on your pants, because that is one of the things you learned not to do. In the same low-key, relentless way, you learned not to slam the screen door and not to leave your bicycle on the front walk where the neighbours could see it looking abandoned. You sit down. You sit up straight. Not because someone has asked you to sit up straight in this particular moment, but because the expectation has been there so many times, so consistently, that it has become part of your body. Your spine knows what is expected of it even when no one is watching. This is how it worked. Not in lectures, not in formal sessions of instruction, not always in words at all. The etiquette of a 1950s American childhood was transmitted through repetition and through the quiet pressure of consistent expectation. You did not sit down one day and read a list of rules. The rules came at you from all directions simultaneously, from your mother and your father and your grandparents and your teachers and the parents of your friends, and the general ambient understanding that certain things were simply done and certain things were simply not. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. And the rules were specific, specifically specific. This was not a vague sense that you should behave nicely. This was a detailed operational code for almost every physical and social situation a child might encounter, and it covered everything from the placement of the silverware to the proper use of the word please, to the correct way to shake an adult's hand, to what you were supposed to do with your eyes when an adult was speaking to you. There were more rules than you could count, and some of them seemed to exist in direct contradiction to your body's natural instincts, which was, you would come to understand, entirely the point. The breakfast table was a training ground. It was not presented as a training ground, it was presented as breakfast. But breakfast had structure, and the structure was enforced with the same gentle, firm consistency that governed everything else. You did not begin eating until everyone was seated, or at minimum until the adult who was serving had indicated that it was time to begin. This was true even if the food was in front of you and you were very hungry. This was true even if you had been awake since 6:30 and the eggs were getting cold. Waiting was part of it. Waiting was, in fact, one of the foundational skills the table was designed to teach. You held your fork correctly. The fork went in the left hand when you were cutting something with the knife in the right hand, and then, because this was America and not England, you switched the fork to the right hand to actually bring the food to your mouth. This was called the American style, though no one called it that at the breakfast table. At the breakfast table, it was simply how you held your fork, and if you held it incorrectly, the correction came quickly and without drama. Not like that. Like this. And you adjusted, and you tried to remember, and sometimes you forgot and had to be reminded again, and eventually, after enough repetitions, your hand just knew. The napkin went in your lap, not tucked into your collar, which was what babies did, and not left on the table while you ate, which was apparently the kind of thing people did when they had not been taught properly, and no one in this house was going to be one of those people. The napkin went in your lap and you used it to dab, not wipe, and you replaced it in your lap after each use. When you left the table, you placed it loosely beside your plate, not folded back into its original shape, but not crumpled either. There was a correct middle ground and it was expected of you. You did not talk with your mouth full. This one was so fundamental, so deeply installed, that by this point in your childhood you barely even registered it as a rule anymore. It was just physics. Your mouth was either for chewing or for talking, not both simultaneously. If someone asked you a question while you were in the middle of a bite, you held up one finger, a single small gesture that meant a moment please, and you finished chewing and swallowed before you answered. This was considered basic. This was not something that earned you praise. You were not complimented for not talking with your mouth full any more than you were complimented for not walking directly into a wall. It was the floor. Everything else was built on top of it. You did not reach across the table. If you needed something, you asked, "Could you please pass the butter? Could you please pass the salt?" You said please not as an ornament, but as a structural component of the sentence, a part of the request without which the request was not a complete object. The salt was passed with the pepper, always, because the salt and pepper travelled together as a pair, and you did not separate them because your reach only extended so far. This was one of the rules that seemed strange if you thought about it too hard, so you learned not to think about it too hard. You just did it. You did not scrape your fork against your teeth. You did not bang your spoon against the rim of your bowl. You did not blow on your soup while it was still in the communal pot, or at least not in a way that was visible to others. You did not make sounds while eating. The specific sounds that food made when it was being processed too enthusiastically, sounds that were considered a commentary on your upbringing and therefore on your family and therefore on everything. The table was quiet in the particular way that a space with 5 people eating breakfast is quiet when everyone is following the same code, a specific domestic silence punctuated by the ordinary sounds of silverware and chairs, and the coffee percolator continuing its work on the counter. You asked to be excused before you left the table. This was not negotiable, and it was not adjustable based on circumstances or mood, even if everyone else was clearly finished, even if you could see your friends outside through the kitchen window, already assembled, already moving toward the street, already having a morning that did not require you to ask permission to stand up. You asked. The asking was the thing. The asking communicated something specific, which was that your presence at this table had been a choice someone made on your behalf, and that your departure from it required the same acknowledgement. You were not furniture. You had been included. And inclusion, in the 1950s household, came with obligations that ran in both directions. These were the breakfast table rules, and they were real, and they were enforced, and most of the children who grew up inside them did not find them particularly extraordinary, because they had never known anything else. But they were only the beginning. The table was where the morning's lessons happened. The rest of the day had its own curriculum. The rules extended beyond the kitchen in ways that were comprehensive to the point of being almost philosophical. There were rules for how you spoke to adults, and these were not the simple rules of tone, though tone was in there too. There was the matter of how you addressed people, and this was not casual. Men and women older than you were Mr. and Mrs., always, even the ones your parents called by their first names, even the ones who had told you, specifically, that you could call them by their first names. Your parents would correct this if it happened. They would correct it not with anger, but with the specific quiet firmness that meant this is not a negotiation. You called the adult by their title and their last name because you were a child, and that was what children did, and the fact that the adult had suggested otherwise was nice of them, but did not change the underlying structure of the situation. When an adult entered the room, you stood up. This was the rule for boys, standing when an adult woman entered, standing when any adult entered a room where you were already seated. Girls were taught a modified version of this, a slight shift of posture, a readiness to stand, an attentiveness that communicated the same underlying message without the full physical performance. The message was, your arrival matters to me. Your presence has been noted and is honoured. I am not so absorbed in whatever I was doing that your entrance into this space went unregistered. You are important enough that my body has responded to your presence. When you shook hands, you shook firmly, not a crushing grip, which was aggressive, and not a limp hand, which was considered weak in a way that attached itself to your character, and not just your hand. You made eye contact while shaking hands. You said pleased to meet you or how do you do, not hey or hi or just your name alone. The handshake was a physical sentence with a beginning and an end, and the content of that sentence was your character. You practiced it. Not in a formal way, not necessarily, but it was practiced. Your father would shake your hand sometimes just to check, in the same way he might check the pressure of the bicycle tyres. Satisfied with the result, he would move on. This was how you knew you had done it correctly. You did not interrupt. This rule was absolute. And it was brutal, in the specific way that rules are brutal when you're 8 years old, and you have something you urgently need to say, and two adults are in the middle of a conversation that has been going on for what seems like the entire afternoon. You waited. If the need was truly urgent, if it could not wait, you stood close to the adult and placed your hand on their arm, lightly, and waited for them to pause and acknowledge you. You did not pull on sleeves. You did not say excuse me 17 times in increasing volume. You placed your hand gently on their arm and you waited, and when they turned to you, you said excuse me please, and then you said the urgent thing, and then you waited while they returned to their conversation before you went back to whatever you'd been doing. The telephone, when it entered into this, had its own set of rules, and these were newer and therefore slightly less settled, but they were still rules. You answered with your last name or with your address sometimes, depending on what your parents had decided was correct. You did not shout into the telephone because the person on the other end could hear you fine, and shouting was not something the telephone required no matter how much it felt like it did. If the call was for someone else, you said one moment please, and you went to find that person, and you did not set the receiver down on a hard surface, because the sound of a receiver landing hard was unpleasant for the person waiting, and therefore it was not something you did. These were small rules, and they were, in their own way, a kind of grace. The physical rules were everywhere, and they were specific, and they were relentless. You did not point at people. You did not stare. You did not whisper in front of others in a way that made them wonder what you were saying about them. You did not make a face when you did not like what was served for dinner. You did not ask how much something cost. You did not ask how old someone was. You did not say you were bored, particularly in front of the person whose home you were visiting, or whose care you were in, because saying you were bored implied that they had failed to provide sufficient entertainment, and that was not a commentary you were permitted to make. You wrote thank you notes. This was not a sometime thing, and it was not something you did when you remembered. When you received a gift, you sat down and you wrote a note, by hand, on paper, and you said what the gift was, and you said something specific about it, something that proved you had actually thought about the gift and not just its existence. Not simply thank you for the gift, which anyone could have written about any gift at any time, but something that connected you specifically to this thing. You mailed the note. If it was a birthday gift from a grandparent, the note went out within the week. There were families where this rule was so firmly established that children wrote thank you notes as a kind of reflex, the way they brush their teeth, without any particular emotional engagement, but with complete consistency. Outside the house, there were rules about how you occupied public space. You walked on the sidewalk and not on other people's lawns, even if the lawn was clearly unoccupied and clearly would not suffer from your passage. You held a door for the person behind you. You stood to the side on the sidewalk if an adult was approaching, and there was not room for both of you to pass without adjusting. You did not run in stores, and you did not touch things in stores unless you were planning to buy them, which was a rule that was complicated by the fact that you almost never had enough money to buy anything in a store. so the rule was effectively that you did not touch things in stores, which was its own particular discipline for a 9-year-old presented with a rack of candy bars. And then there was church. Church had its own separate and complete system of etiquette that overlapped with, but was distinct from the general household code. You sat still. You did not fidget in ways that were visible. You did not swing your feet, not because swinging your feet was actually dangerous, but because it communicated that you were not paying attention, and not paying attention in church was a statement about more than your attention. You did not whisper during the service. You did not turn around to see who had just come in. You did not make noise with the bulletin. There were children who could spend an entire church service without making any sound at all, and they were considered well-raised in the particular way that term was used in the 1950s, which was as close to a compliment as a child was likely to receive in that context. The world had a texture to it, this world of rules and expectations, and the texture was not unpleasant. It was firm, it had edges. It told you exactly where you were at every moment, because at every moment there was a standard against which your behaviour was being measured, and you knew what the standard was, and you were either meeting it or you were not. And if you were not, the correction came, calmly, consistently, without drama, and you adjusted, and you tried again. There was, inside this system, a strange kind of security. The rules were not arbitrary, or they did not feel arbitrary, even when they were. They felt like the shape of the world itself, the way walls feel structural even when they are only wallboard. You were 8, or 9, or 10, and you were learning something that the adults around you could not have fully articulated because it was too large and too woven into everything they did to separate out into language. You were learning that your body was a social object, that the way you held it, moved it, used it in relation to other bodies in other rooms, communicated something specific and legible and important, that you were always, in some sense, sending a message, and the only question was whether you were sending the message intentionally or not. And the intention they were teaching you was something you could learn to have. What it cost you to have that intention was a particular kind of spontaneity, a particular kind of ease. There were adults who had been raised this way who moved through the world with a careful precision that came from a lifetime of monitoring themselves, and the precision was beautiful in its own way, a form of consideration, but it was also sometimes exhausting. That was the thing the etiquette books did not put in their pages, that keeping track of everything was work, steady, continuous, unremarked upon work, and the children who did it best were the ones who learned to do it while appearing not to be working at all. By evening, when the day was done and the dishes were washed and put away, when your father had read the newspaper and your mother had finished whatever it was she was finishing, you sat at the table to do your homework and the kitchen smelled of dish soap and the quiet, particular smell of a gas burner recently turned off. You were tired. Not dramatically tired, just the ordinary tired of a child who had been performing for most of the day. You put your elbow on the table, you caught yourself, you removed it, you sat up straighter. The rules did not stop when the audience went to bed. The rules by now were partly inside you, and that, your mother would have told you if you had asked, was entirely the point. There were rules about money, and these were perhaps the most socially charged of all the rules, because money was the subject that etiquette was most urgently designed to make invisible. In the 1950s American household, the discussion of money in front of children, or in front of guests, or in front of anyone who might use the information in ways that were uncomfortable, was considered a form of vulgarity that ranked alongside the other great social failures. You did not ask what something cost. You did not discuss salaries. You did not, when a gift was given, say how much it was worth. These rules served multiple purposes simultaneously, some of them perfectly sensible, and some of them considerably less so, but together they produced a particular kind of silence around the material conditions of people's lives that was, in the 1950s, treated as a mark of sophistication. The sophistication was partly genuine. There is something to be said for the practice of keeping economic anxiety out of social occasions, of not reducing every gathering to a comparison of financial circumstances. People at a dinner party who spend the evening discussing their household budgets in specific terms are probably not having as much fun as they might be having. The silence around money had that legitimate dimension to it, but it also had the dimension of concealment, the keeping up of appearances that was itself one of the defining activities of post-war suburban life, the shared agreement not to notice how much debt was behind the new refrigerator and the new car and the family vacation to a lake in Michigan. The etiquette around money was partly about consideration and partly about collective fiction, and the children learning the rules were absorbing both parts at once without being able to distinguish between them. They were also learning, though no one said it in these terms, that certain topics had a weight to them that required special handling. Death was one, money was another, other people's misfortunes were a third. The rules around these subjects were more complex than the fork rules because they required not just the right behaviour but the right silence, the ability to not say the thing that was true and obvious, and perhaps urgently relevant in the specific moment, because saying it would cause a kind of discomfort that the social occasion was not designed to accommodate. Children who were good at this, who had absorbed the art of the tactful non-mention, the graceful change of subject, the acknowledgement of difficulty without dwelling in it. These children were considered unusually poised, which was the highest compliment available in this particular vocabulary. Poise was the goal. It was the word that appeared most often in the etiquette books and the etiquette columns and the instruction programs, the word that captured what all the specific rules were building toward. Not correctness exactly, though correctness was necessary. Not sophistication, though sophistication was part of it. Poise, the state of being balanced, composed, at ease in the situation you were in. Poise implied that you had resources available to you, that you had been trained and had practiced and had internalized enough of the code that you could now move through the world without having to think about the code every step, that the thinking had been completed in advance, and what remained was the freedom that came from having done the thinking. It was, as descriptions of goals go, fairly accurate. The children who had been most thoroughly trained in the etiquette of their era did move through the world with a particular ease, a comfort in formal situations, an ability to manage social moments that might have been awkward without the training. They knew what to do with their hands at a cocktail party. They knew how to introduce themselves to someone important without seeming either nervous or presumptuous. They knew the difference between the fork for fish and the fork for the main course, and this knowledge, small as it was, freed them from the specific anxiety of not knowing, which was itself a kind of noise, a low background distraction that took up space that could have been used for the conversation. But poise was also, in the way it was described and taught and measured, a very specific kind of ease, an ease that was available in specific rooms and not in others, an ease that was the product of having learned the code of specific rooms and not the codes of other rooms. The child who was poised at a formal dinner table might be considerably less poised at a table set with different conventions, with different equipment, with different expectations about what the body was supposed to do and what the conversation was supposed to contain. The poise that the Etiquette project produced was not universal human ease. It was ease within a specific social frame, and it was contingent on the frame remaining stable. This contingency was rarely discussed, because discussing it would have required acknowledging that the frame was not universal, that other frames existed with their own validity and their own forms of grace, and that the choice to invest so much in the mastery of this particular frame was itself a choice, not a simple response to how things were. But in the 1950s, in the specific social world that the Etiquette project served, the frame felt stable, felt given, felt like the structure of things rather than a structure among other possible structures, and so the children learned it as though they were learning something permanent, something that would be true in every room they would ever enter. Some of them spent the rest of their lives adjusting that assumption, finding the rooms where the frame did not apply, learning other ways of being at ease, discovering that the poise they had worked so hard to acquire was portable but not universal, useful in some contexts and a slight impediment in others, a tool rather than a truth. That adjustment, gradual and often unnoticed, is part of the long aftermath of an etiquette education. The rules you were given become the rules you eventually evaluate, and the evaluation, honest and specific, is its own form of grace, one the books did not include because they could not have known that their students would need it. The rules about personal appearance were their own substantial category, and in the 1950s they were enforced with a consistency that made the fork rules look casual. Your clothes, when you appeared in any social context, were to be clean, pressed and appropriate to the occasion, and the word appropriate carried a great deal of freight. Appropriate meant not too formal and not too casual, not too new-looking and not too worn, not too bright and not too dull. It meant that you had thought about where you were going and what was expected there and had dressed accordingly, which was itself a form of consideration, a way of saying to the people you were about to be with that you had taken the occasion seriously enough to prepare for it. Shoes were polished, hair was arranged. Boys wore belts if their pants had belt loops, and the belt matched the shoes if at all possible. Not always possible on a child's budget, but the principle was understood. Girls wore clean white socks with their dresses to church and had their hair done in ways that varied by era and by family, but that were consistently done, meaning deliberately arranged, not simply left to whatever it had decided to do on its own during the night. A girl arriving anywhere with her hair not done was communicating something her parents did not want communicated, and she was told this, not unkindly, and she went upstairs and fixed it. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. These rules about appearance were closely connected to the rules about public behaviour in a way that is worth making explicit. When you were in public, you represented your family. This was stated in many households with considerable directness. You are a reflection of this family. You are representing this family. Whatever you do out there, you are doing it as a member of this family. This framing transformed every public appearance into a form of advocacy, a small ongoing argument for your family's quality as a family. A child who behaved badly in public was not just behaving badly. They were making a claim about their family that their parents would have to answer for, in the unspoken but very real social accounting that went on among neighbours and church members and the other parents at school. This gave children a social responsibility that could feel very large for small people. They were not only responsible for themselves, they were responsible for the family's public face, and the family's public face was not something that was built in one afternoon and then settled. It was built continuously, from every interaction, from the way you said good morning to the neighbour, and the way you held the door, and the way you behaved in the grocery store, and the way you looked when you got out of the car. All of these things were data points in an ongoing assessment that your neighbours and your community were always making. Not maliciously, but simply because human beings and communities are always assessing each other, and the assessment was of your family, not just of you. The children who internalised this responsibility carried it in their bodies. You could see it in the specific alertness they maintained in public spaces, the awareness of who was watching and what was being communicated. Some of them found this exhausting and were relieved when they were old enough to set some of it down. Others carried it into adulthood and found that it had become so embedded that setting it down was not really possible, that the awareness was simply part of them now, a permanent orientation toward the room they were in and the people in it and what was being communicated and whether it was the right thing. What it produced at its best was a generation of people who were genuinely thoughtful about the social impact of their behaviour, who considered before they acted, who understood that the space between two people was a space that needed tending. What it produced, at its less than best, was a generation of people who were very tired, who had been monitoring themselves for so long that the monitoring had become invisible, who could not always tell the difference between what they actually wanted to do and what they had been taught to want to do, because the teaching had been so thorough and so early that the two things had fused together somewhere below the level of conscious awareness. Both of these outcomes are real. Both of them live in the same person, often in the body of the child who learned to ask to be excused and is now old and sitting at their own table, with grandchildren who have not been taught to ask to be excused, which is a fact that produces a complicated feeling, something between loss and relief, something between missing the world that was and understanding why it changed. The rules about gratitude were their own complete system, and they are worth examining in some detail because they reveal something important about what the whole Etiquette project believed about the relationship between behaviour and feeling. In the 1950s, gratitude was not a matter of whether you felt it, it was a matter of whether you expressed it, in the correct form, at the correct time, to the correct person. The thank you note was the most formal expression of this requirement, but it was far from the only one. There was also the verbal thank you, which had its own rules. You said thank you for a specific thing, not for a general experience, not thank you for having me over, though that was acceptable as far as it went, but thank you for the wonderful dinner, or thank you for the birthday present, or thank you for thinking of me when you knew I was unwell. The specificity communicated attention. It said, "I was paying attention to what you did, and I am acknowledging that specific thing because that thing was for me and I recognized it as such." The verbal thank you happened immediately, as close to the moment of the gift or the kindness as possible. The written thank you happened within the week, ideally within a few days, and it was not acceptable to wait until you had used the gift or to delay, because the act of writing the note felt daunting. The note was not about your convenience. It was about the recipient's experience, which was the experience of having given something and then wondering whether it had been appreciated, and the sooner you resolved that wondering, the more considerate you had been. Children were taught this with a specificity that made the principle clear. The person who gave you the gift spent time choosing it, and money buying it, and thought on wrapping it, and effort getting it to you. And the note is your acknowledgement that you know that you're not taking any of that for granted, that you're the kind of person who notices what other people do for you and says so. This was, on its own terms, a beautiful teaching. The cultivation of expressed gratitude is one of the things the Etiquette project got straightforwardly right, and the children who grew up writing thank you notes as a matter of course were being trained in a habit that served them well for the rest of their lives, not because note writing in itself is deeply important, but because the orientation it expressed, the orientation of noticing and acknowledging what other people do for you, is deeply important, and the habit of expressing it formally creates and reinforces the habit of feeling it. The flip side of the gratitude rules was the graciousness rules, the rules about how you received gratitude, how you accepted compliments, how you responded when someone said something kind about your cooking or your home or your children. This was more complicated because the 1950s had a particular relationship with pride that required careful management. Pride was acceptable in certain forms and in certain contexts, and was deeply uncomfortable in others. You were allowed to be pleased when someone complimented your cooking. You were not allowed to say, "Yes, I know, I am an excellent cook." The correct response was something more modest, something that acknowledged the compliment without either rejecting it entirely, which was false, or accepting it completely, which was presumptuous. Something like, "How kind of you," or "I am so glad you enjoyed it," or "It is an old family recipe," which transferred the credit to something larger than yourself. These were small performances of a particular kind of self-effacement that was considered gracious in women, and in a different form in men too, though the performances were somewhat different by gender. The children learning these responses were learning something that went beyond social form. They were learning a whole theory of the self in relation to others, a theory that said the self was best served by appearing to subordinate itself to the occasion, that the most effective form of social presence was the one that drew the least attention to itself, that the measure of a successful social performance was not how impressed people were by you, but how comfortable they felt in your presence. This is a coherent philosophy. It has a lot to recommend it. It also has costs which the era did not discuss very thoroughly, and those costs fell most heavily on the people who were already, for structural reasons, being asked to make themselves smaller. But that is a layer of the analysis that the dinner table conversations of the 1950s were not generally equipped to accommodate. The rules about guests were their own substantial chapter in the Etiquette, Education of a Child, and they were among the most practically demanding rules because guests actually arrived in real time in the actual house, and the rules had to be executed with real people watching. The guest came first. This principle organised everything else. The guest's comfort was the host's responsibility, not in a servile sense, but in the sense that the host had issued the invitation and the guest had accepted it on the implicit promise that the occasion would be managed well. Managing it well meant anticipating needs, foreseeing difficulties, smoothing over awkwardness, and doing all of this without visible effort, which was the social equivalent of performing a complicated athletic maneuver and then not mentioning that it was complicated. Children participated in the management of guests in ways that were themselves instructional. When company was coming, the house was prepared to a standard that exceeded the ordinary standard, and children were expected to contribute to that preparation and to understand why it was happening. The good china was brought out, and the children understood from this that occasions had levels, that the china represented a specific investment of care that was being made for specific people at a specific time. The guest bathroom was cleaned with particular thoroughness, and children understood from this that the people who were coming would be forming impressions of the household, and that those impressions began in the details. The guest room, if there was one, was made up with the good linens and something small and welcoming placed there, and children understood from this that hospitality was not only about the food and the conversation, but about the anticipation of what someone might need when they arrived and the provision of it before they had to ask. When guests arrived, children in the household had roles to play. If old enough, they greeted guests at the door, took coats, said welcome, or something equivalent in whatever form was appropriate to the formality of the occasion. They did not disappear immediately to their rooms, which was considered rude, but they also did not monopolize the guests' attention with their own stories and concerns, which was considered a different kind of rudeness. They were present, pleasant, appropriately engaged, and then, at the right moment, they withdrew. Knowing the right moment was itself a skill that was not taught in any direct way, but was absorbed from observation and from the specific look on a parent's face that said, "The moment has arrived." These were the rules as they lived in the daily practice of ordinary households, in the actual texture of the actual week. They were taught not in one sitting, but in hundreds of small corrections and demonstrations and examples, in the life of the kitchen and the dining room and the front door and the church pew and the neighbour's yard. They were taught by people who had themselves been taught, who had themselves absorbed the rules through the same slow process of repetition and example and correction, and who were passing on what they had received, imperfectly but sincerely, to children who would in turn pass it on in modified form to their own. The modification is important. Each generation that inherits the code also adjusts it, drops what no longer serves, keeps what does, adds what new circumstances require. The 1950s code that the children of that era received was itself a modified version of the code their parents had received, which was a modified version of the code before that. Emily Post's revisions tracked this process formally. The informal version of the process happened in every household that ever sat down to dinner and told a child to put their napkin in their lap. The code is always in transit. It is always in the process of becoming the next version of itself, and the children learning it at any given moment are both the recipients of what came before and the agents of what comes next. The rules that governed how children spoke, and specifically how they addressed the adults in their world, had their own elaborate geography, and navigating it required a kind of social GPS that most children developed through accumulated experience rather than through any formal instruction. The formal instruction told you the principle. Adults were Mr. and Mrs. always, and yes ma'am and no ma'am were the correct responses to certain questions, and no sir was better than just no, and a certain level of formality was always appropriate when addressing someone older than you. But the application of these principles in specific situations was something you figured out by watching, by listening, by occasionally getting it wrong and being corrected, and by slowly building up a map of the social terrain that told you what was expected in each type of room and each type of encounter. The school was its own particular landscape of etiquette, with its own subset of rules that interacted with but were distinct from the household rules. You raised your hand before speaking. This was so fundamental that it barely registered as a rule, but the raising of the hand was itself a small act of etiquette, an acknowledgement that the classroom was a shared space with multiple people who all wanted to speak, and that a system for managing that competing desire was necessary, and that you were participating in the system willingly, rather than simply fighting for airtime. You waited to be called on. You spoke when called on, not before. These were the mechanics of the classroom, and they were taught and enforced from the first day of the first grade with a consistency that made them feel like the natural order of things. You did not call the teacher by her first name. This was, in the 1950s, not even a consideration that arose. The teacher was Miss or Mrs., and then her last name, and this remained true even for teachers who were warm and informal in their manner, even for teachers who clearly liked their students and who were clearly liked in return. The title was not about emotional distance. It was about structural clarity, a delineation of the roles in the room and the responsibilities that came with those roles. The teacher was responsible for the education of the students. The students were responsible for engaging with that education. The titles marked the boundary between those two responsibilities, and the marking was considered useful and clear and not unfriendly. Outside school, the neighbourhood itself was a complex etiquette zone, with its own conventions and expectations that children absorbed through years of daily exposure. You knew which adults on your block expected to be greeted by name and which ones you could pass with a nod. You knew whose yard was absolutely not a thoroughfare and whose was understood to be a reasonable shortcut. You knew which neighbours would notice if you did not say good morning and would mention it to your parents, and which neighbours were less concerned. This knowledge was social intelligence of a fairly high order, accumulated over years of daily navigation of a small geographic space that was also a very complex social space. The rules about the telephone deserve considerably more space than they sometimes get in accounts of this era, because the telephone was still a relatively new social instrument in the 1950s, new enough that its etiquette was not yet fully settled, which made the specific rules around it feel more deliberately constructed than rules that had evolved over centuries. You answered the telephone before the fourth ring, if at all possible, because allowing it to ring more than 4 times was considered inconsiderate to the person calling, who was presumably waiting with some purpose. You said hello, or you said your family's last name, or you gave your phone number, depending on what your parents had decided was the correct form for your household. You did not say yeah, or what, or who is it, in the sharp, direct tone that might have felt natural, because the telephone projected tone of voice with particular clarity, and the person on the other end could hear exactly what you thought of having to answer the phone. If the call was a wrong number, you were polite. You said, "I am sorry, this is not that number," and you wished the caller a good day. You did not simply hang up. You did not say any of the things that a wrong number call in the middle of a busy afternoon might tempt you to say. You were polite because being polite was the rule even with strangers, perhaps especially with strangers, because with strangers you had nothing but your manners to communicate who you were and who you were was. In this framing, an extension of who your family was. If you placed a call, you identified yourself. You said, "This is so-and-so calling, may I please speak to so-and-so?" You did not assume that your voice was recognizable. You did not begin speaking as though the person on the other end already knew who you were. You stated your name and your purpose with a clarity and a brevity that communicated both respect for the other person's time and confidence in your own right to be calling. If you had reached the household but not the specific person you wanted, you said, "Thank you very much. I will call back later." Or, "Could you please tell them I called?" You did not leave long messages with whoever answered, because the person who answered was not your personal message service. You left your name, possibly a brief indication of your purpose, and you let the person call you back if they chose to. The rules about voices and volume were not only about the telephone, they extended to every situation, and they were, in the 1950s, considerably more specific than the general injunction to keep your voice down. You spoke quietly in public spaces, meaning spaces you shared with people who were not part of your immediate group, because the people around you had not chosen to hear your conversation and were entitled not to. This was the rule in libraries, in stores, in churches, on public transportation, in waiting rooms, anywhere that your voice carried beyond your immediate party. The rule was enforced by parents with a specific gesture, a light touch on the arm or a look that meant, "Lower your voice." Children in these families became very good at reading that gesture and responding to it before it needed to become a word. Laughing in public was acceptable, but shrieking or screaming, which was often the more natural expression of the same emotion in a 10-year-old body, was not. Crying in public was handled differently by different families and in different circumstances, but the general principle was that visible emotional display in public spaces was something to be managed, contained, or redirected as quickly as possible. Not because emotions were wrong, but because public spaces were shared spaces and the people in them had not necessarily signed up to witness your emotional experience, and consideration for those people was the ongoing obligation. The rules about food in public fell into the same category. You did not eat while walking except at specific events like county fairs or outdoor festivals, where that was the understood mode. You did not eat in public spaces unless you were at a restaurant or at a picnic or at some other occasion that was organised around the eating. You did not unwrap candy on a bus, not because candy was wrong, but because the noise of the unwrapping was inconsiderate to the people around you, and the smell of the candy was an imposition on the people who had not chosen to be near candy at that particular moment. These rules, which can sound extreme from the distance of a different era, were part of the same underlying philosophy. You're not alone, you're always in relation to other people, and that relation carries obligations. The particular challenge of the public space rules was that they required children to maintain a level of awareness and self-regulation in contexts where the usual supports, the parental presence, the familiar environment, were absent or reduced. When you were in a store without your parents, or on a school trip without the direct oversight of the specific adults who had trained you, you were expected to carry the rules inside you and apply them without external enforcement. This was itself a developmental goal, the internalization of the code to the point where it operated independently. The training was working when the child in the store alone put back the item they had thoughtlessly picked up and remembered the rule about not touching things without intending to buy them. The training was working when the child on the bus lowered their voice because they had noticed a woman nearby who seemed to be trying to read. The training was working when the code generated the correct behaviour without needing someone to enforce it. That internalization was what the whole project was building toward, and it is, in retrospect, both impressive and complicated. Impressive because the production of internalized social norms is genuinely difficult, and the fact that it happened at all, that these children carried these codes through their lives in ways that shaped their behaviour in rooms their parents would never see, suggests that the training was effective. Complicated because the norms that were internalized were not a perfect set of rules, but a historically specific, culturally particular set of rules, and the people who internalized them most completely were also the people who had the most difficult time when the norms shifted, as they inevitably did, and the rules they had absorbed so thoroughly were no longer the rules the world was using. The rules about disagreement were subtle and taught mostly by example rather than direct instruction, and they reveal something important about the social philosophy that underlay the whole Etiquette project. In the 1950s, American household, disagreeing with an adult, particularly one outside the immediate family, was handled with considerable care. This was not because disagreement was forbidden, but because the expression of disagreement was governed by rules about how and when and to whom it was expressed. You did not contradict an adult in front of other people. If you knew that what an adult had said was incorrect, if you had information they lacked, or a perspective they had not considered, you found a private moment to introduce this information. You did not score points in public at someone else's expense. This rule was more sophisticated than it first appears. It was based on the understanding that public correction is a form of humiliation, that being told you are wrong in front of an audience is a different experience from being told you are wrong in private, and that the difference matters to the person being corrected in ways that should be considered by the person doing the correcting. The etiquette around disagreement was, in this sense, a form of genuine consideration, an acknowledgement that the feelings of the person being corrected were worth taking into account even when the correction itself was necessary and accurate. But it also had the dimension of social maintenance, of keeping the surface smooth at the cost of direct truth-telling, and this dimension is more complicated. There were things that were not said on the theory that saying them would cause discomfort, and some of those things were things that probably should have been said. The etiquette of conflict avoidance, which was one of the defining features of the code in its mid-century form, produced surfaces that were very smooth and interiors that were sometimes very complicated, and the children who learned to maintain the surface sometimes had less practice than they needed in navigating the interior. That is a cost. It is real. And it showed up later in lives that were very gracious on the outside and sometimes very confused on the inside, in the specific confusion of people who had been taught what to say and how to say it, but had not been given quite as much guidance on what to feel and what to do with the feeling. The rules did not begin with the 1950s, though that decade gets much of the credit, or the blame, depending on who you ask. The code that governed American children's behaviour in that bright, pressured, carefully arranged era had roots that went back much further, wound through decades of immigration and aspiration, and the particular American anxiety about class and belonging that never quite goes away. By 1950, those roots had grown into something dense and specific, and the soil they grew in was tended by schools and churches and women's magazines and the Sunday dinner table, and, not least of all, by a whole industry of books and pamphlets and etiquette instruction programs that told Americans calmly and in detail how to behave. The premise was simple, or at least it was presented as simple. There was a correct way to do almost everything, and children who learned the correct way early enough and thoroughly enough would move through the world with a confidence and a social ease that would serve them in every circumstance. Jobs, marriages, friendships, the delicate negotiations of neighbourhood life, all of these were easier, the argument went. for people who knew which fork to use and when to send a thank you note and how to introduce two people who had never met. Etiquette was not about snobbery, or so the books insisted. It was about consideration for others. It was about making the people around you comfortable. It was, in the language that got used most often, about putting your best foot forward, which was a phrase that implied there was a better foot and a worse foot, and that you had to think about which was which before you entered the room. The children who grew up inside this system remember it differently, depending on who they are and where they grew up, and what the system cost them and what it gave them. Some remember it as a kind of anchor, a set of certainties in a world that was changing faster than anyone was quite prepared for. Some remember it as a wall, a system of small prohibitions that told them at every turn what they were not. Some remember specific rules with a clarity that suggests those rules landed somewhere deep, somewhere below the surface of ordinary memory, in the place where the body stores what it has been repeatedly told to do, and eventually begins to do without being told. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. The elbow rule, the please and thank you rule, the standing up rule, the not pointing rule, the asking to be excused rule, they come back to people, these rules, sometimes without warning, in the middle of an ordinary moment at an ordinary table in a world that has largely moved on from the specific enforcement mechanisms of the 1950s. And what comes back with them is not always resentment, and not always warmth, but something more complicated. The recognition that someone cared enough to teach them, that the teaching was imperfect and sometimes misguided, and sometimes used as a tool for things that had nothing to do with consideration, but that inside the imperfection there was something genuine, an attempt to give children a working relationship with the social world they were about to inhabit. The table manners and the thank you notes and the firm handshakes were, at their core, about one thing: readiness. The idea that a child who moved through the world with awareness and consideration and a basic literacy in the social codes of their time was a child who was prepared. And preparation in the 1950s was everything. The decade was organised around the idea of preparation: the well-stocked pantry, the well-maintained lawn, the well-behaved children. These were evidence of a family that was ready for company, for catastrophe, for whatever the world presented next. And the children, trained and tested and corrected until the rules became part of their bodies, were the most visible evidence of all. There is something worth pausing on before we move to the woman who did more than anyone else to codify what all of this was supposed to look like. Because behind every child correcting their elbow placement, and behind every mother watching for the correction to take hold, was a larger argument about who Americans were and who they ought to be. And no one made that argument more skillfully, more persistently, or with more commercial success than a woman named Emily Post. She was born in 1872 into a world that took manners seriously in a way that was almost geological, stratified and ancient and slow to shift. Her father was Bruce Price, an architect of considerable reputation, and she grew up in the kind of household where the social forms were not studied but simply inhabited, the way you inhabit a house you were born in and never think about its foundation. Baltimore first, then New York, then Newport and Bar Harbor in the summer, the rotation of the well-placed family moving through the seasons of a world that had its own geography. She married Edwin Post, and the marriage produced 2 sons and eventually, after some years, a quiet and very proper divorce. None of this appeared in the etiquette books later. Emily Post was not interested in providing a target for the kind of scrutiny she had spent her life learning to deflect. She began as a novelist. This is the part of her story that tends to surprise people, and it should not, because everything she did as a novelist turned out to be preparation for what she did next. Her novels were light, social, observant. They were set in the world she knew, the resorts and drawing rooms and country houses of upper-class American life, and they paid attention to the rituals of that world with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood that the rituals were the story, that the way people behaved at table and in doorways and in the presence of grief told you everything about the world they had built and were trying to maintain. The novels did not make her famous, but they trained her eye and her ear for exactly the kind of detail that would eventually make her the most widely read authority on behaviour in American history. The book came out in 1922, Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics and at Home. The title alone covered more territory than most writers attempt in a career. The timing was specific and important. America in 1922 was in the process of a complicated self-renegotiation. The old social structures, the ones that had organised American life along clear lines of class and ancestry, and the right kind of education, were being disrupted by immigration and industrialisation, and the particular democratic turbulence that the post-war years had stirred up. New money was arriving in places where old money had previously felt quite comfortable. Newly arrived families from Eastern Europe and southern Italy and dozens of other places were becoming American as fast as circumstances allowed, and being American meant learning the codes, and the codes were not written down anywhere that was easy to find. Emily Post wrote them down, all of them, in practical, specific, organised prose that managed to be both authoritative and readable, which was not easy to achieve and which turned out to be the precise combination that the American reading public in 1922 was waiting for. The book was a commercial phenomenon almost immediately. Editions followed editions. The book was revised and updated as the world changed, and it kept selling through the 20s and the 30s and the Depression years and the war years, and into the post-war boom that produced the world of perfectly set tables and standing children that we have been visiting tonight. Emily Post revised her book more than once during her lifetime, each revision adjusting the standards to account for the shifts in American life, the democratization of travel and dining and social occasions that the post-war economy was producing. She understood something that her critics, and she had critics, did not quite grasp. She understood that etiquette was not primarily about exclusion, though it could be used for exclusion, and sometimes was. It was primarily about a kind of social ease, the reduction of friction between people who had to share space and occasions and moments of both celebration and grief. The rules existed in her framing because they gave everyone a script. If you know what to do when someone dies, you're freed from the paralysis of not knowing. If you know what to say when you're introduced to someone, you're freed from the anxiety of silence. The rules were not a wall. They were, in her telling, a set of handles on a world that otherwise had very few places to grip. This was generous, and it was partly true, and it was also the best possible reading of a system that did not always operate so charitably. Emily Post herself was careful, in her books, to distinguish between the letter of the rule and the spirit behind it. She wrote that the underpinning of all good manners was consideration for other people, and that any rule which failed to serve that principle was not a rule worth keeping. She wrote about the formidable Mrs. Worldly, one of her fictional exemplars, with a certain dry warmth that acknowledged the comedy inherent in taking these things too seriously. She was not without humour. She was not without the capacity to see herself from the outside. But the system she described and that her book helped install in American households was a system with real consequences. By the 1950s, when her influence had been percolating for 3 decades and had mixed with everything from the home economics curriculum in public schools to the etiquette columns in women's magazines to the programs run by churches and community organisations, the code had become something close to universal among the families who read the magazines and attended the churches and sent their children to the schools. Not universal in the sense that everyone followed it, universal in the sense that everyone knew it, and that everyone who knew it also knew that departing from it was a form of statement. The book continued to sell after her death in 1960. Etiquette in society, in business, in politics and at home was updated by the family and has remained in print in various forms for more than a century. The editions change with the times, accommodating new technologies and new social arrangements, but the underlying argument has remained consistent, that paying attention to how you move through the world, how you occupy space in relation to other people, how you mark the significant moments of shared human life, is a form of intelligence that can be developed, and that developing it costs something and gives back something in return. Emily Post spent her life making that argument, clearly, specifically, and with the particular conviction of someone who believed it completely and had the manners to prove it. What made her unusual among the authorities of her era was her insistence that the spirit of a rule mattered more than its letter. There are letters in the archive, letters from readers who wrote to her with their specific dilemmas, whether to use the fish fork, what to do when a guest arrives unexpected, how to write a condolence note when you did not know the deceased well, and her answers were always practical and always pointed toward the same underlying principle. The goal was not correctness for its own sake. The goal was kindness made visible through form. The rule existed to serve the relationship, and if the rule was getting in the way of the relationship, you set the rule aside. This was wisdom, quietly offered, in a century that needed it. And the children learning their fork placement in the 1950s were, without knowing it, the inheritors of her argument. Whether they internalized the spirit or only the letter was something each of them worked out for themselves over years in the specific circumstances of their particular lives, at tables very different from the ones they had learned it as children. The world she'd written about, the world of Newport and Bar Harbor, was not the world most of her readers lived in. It was the aspiration, the image at the end of the long corridor of American ambition, the world where everything was done correctly, and the doing of it correctly had become so habitual that it was no longer effort but simply presence. Most Americans were not there, but Emily Post had the capacity to write about that world in a way that made the reader feel that the distance was navigable, that the rules were learnable, that the world on the other side of the instruction was available to anyone willing to do the work of learning. This was democratic. It was also, in its own way, a kind of marketing. But that is perhaps too cynical a reading of something that gave genuine comfort and genuine tools to a genuinely uncertain public. She had, in the end, built something durable. Not a set of rules that stayed fixed. Rules changed. Forks moved. Formal occasions became less formal. Social structures shifted in ways that made some of her specific advice obsolete even within her own lifetime. But the project she had undertaken, the attempt to write down the social code clearly enough that anyone could learn it, that project had a life of its own, and it shaped the children of the 1950s in ways that those children, now old, can still feel when they sit down at a table and notice, without quite knowing why, that something about the setting feels off. The 1950s were, in terms of etiquette instruction, an unusually productive decade, and Emily Post was not working alone. She was the most famous, the most widely read, and perhaps the most careful, but there was an entire ecosystem of etiquette authority operating in America by mid-century, and it reached into places that her books did not necessarily go. There were etiquette columns in local newspapers, written by women who signed their columns with gentle, authoritative names and answered questions about thank you notes and introductions and the correct behaviour at a christening. There were etiquette segments on the radio programmes that women listened to while they worked in their kitchens in the morning. There were etiquette features in the women's magazines, in the Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping and McCall's, laid out with photographs of correctly set tables and diagrams of proper fork placement. The same information Emily Post had been dispensing for decades now filtered through the visual grammar of the post-war magazine. And then there were the programmes, the in-person programmes, the classes and workshops and finishing courses that brought the instruction out of the page and into the room, where a woman with a clipboard and good posture could watch you eat a meal and tell you what you were doing wrong. These programs existed at multiple levels of society and cost and formality. At the top, the finishing schools, which had their own long history and their own particular approach to the question of what a young woman needed to know before she entered the world. Below that, the etiquette courses offered by churches, by the YWCA, by civic organisations, by department stores that had understood rather brilliantly that a woman who had learned about entertaining in a formal department store setting was considerably more likely to buy her entertaining supplies from that department store. These programs were not only for girls, though girls received considerably more instruction than boys, and the instruction they received was also more comprehensive and more physical, and more focused on the body as a social instrument. Boys learned the firm handshake, the standing up, the please and thank you, and the correct forms of address. Girls learned all of that, and also how to walk, how to sit, how to enter a room, how to pour tea, how to seat themselves and rise gracefully from a chair, how to carry themselves in a way that communicated a specific kind of composed, contained self-possession that was considered the hallmark of a well-raised young woman. The people who delivered these lessons were, themselves, a particular kind of figure in the 1950s American social landscape, and it is worth spending some time with them because they were doing something more complicated than it appeared from the outside, and they knew it, and most of them did it anyway. There was a woman, let us call her by the most common of names from her era, call her Dorothy, though she might have been a Helen or a Margaret or a Ruth. She was in 1955 somewhere in her late 30s or early 40s, and she had spent the previous decade accumulating the specific combination of credentials and personal authority that made it possible to stand in front of a room full of other people's children and tell them what to do. She'd perhaps attended a program herself years ago. She'd perhaps read Emily Post so thoroughly that she could cite specific passages in her sleep, which she sometimes did. She'd perhaps trained through one of the organisations that certified etiquette instructors, organisations that existed and were taken seriously in the way that organisations dedicated to specific and important knowledge are taken seriously. She ran her classes out of the church hall on Tuesday afternoons, or perhaps out of the back room of the dress shop owned by a woman whose husband was on the city council, or perhaps in the gymnasium of the elementary school where she also taught home economics 3 mornings a week. The room was always slightly too warm or slightly too cold, the chairs were never quite right for the purpose, and the table she used for demonstration, borrowed from somewhere else, and carried in by a deacon or a shop assistant or a janitor who had been asked very nicely, was never quite the right height. None of this bothered her. She had been teaching long enough to understand that the setting was not the thing. The thing was the attention you could generate inside whatever setting you had. Emily Post's world was not the only world producing etiquette authority in the 1950s, though she was unquestionably the most famous practitioner of the art. There was a whole supporting cast of advisors and columnists and instructors who filled in the spaces her book left open, who addressed the specific concerns of specific communities, who adapted the general code to the particular circumstances of a country that was rapidly changing in ways that the formal etiquette tradition was not always quick to accommodate. One of the most interesting of these adaptations was the emergence of etiquette instruction, specifically targeted at the newly prosperous middle class that the post-war economy was producing at remarkable speed. These were families who had grown up in circumstances considerably more modest than the ones they now occupied. Families who had moved from apartments in cities to houses in suburbs, from working-class wages to white-collar salaries, from the informal social world of their parents to the more formal social world of their new neighbours and new employers and new community organisations. They had the means now to entertain, to have dinner parties, to host occasions that required a fully set table and a properly worded invitation. What they did not always have was the certainty about how to do it correctly, and that uncertainty was uncomfortable in the specific grinding way that social uncertainty is uncomfortable. The sense that everyone else in the room knows the code and you are the only one who has to work it out in real time. The etiquette books and columns and courses were, for these families, a genuine resource, not a luxury, not an affectation, but a practical tool for navigating a social world they were new to. A woman who had grown up in a household where meals were informal and the silverware was limited, and the entertaining was casual, could use Emily Post's book the way she used a cookbook, as a reliable guide to producing a specific result that she had not grown up knowing how to produce. And the result, when it worked, was real. A dinner party that flowed without awkwardness, a table that communicated thoughtfulness and care, guests who left feeling that they had been well received, which was a form of social success that the post-war middle class cared about intensely and was willing to work hard to achieve. This worked in both directions, of course. The women who were providing the guidance through books and columns and classes were not simply sharing neutral information. They were also shaping aspirations, defining what a successful household looked like, creating a standard against which every dinner party was being measured, consciously or not. The magazines that ran etiquette features alongside their recipes and home decorating spreads were building a coherent image of the ideal post-war household, and the etiquette was one of the features of that image, as much a part of it as the correct refrigerator and the correctly decorated living room. To buy into the etiquette was, in a sense, to buy into the whole package. The department stores understood this better than almost anyone else. By the mid-1950s, several major department stores had developed formal etiquette programs, offered in their restaurants or in dedicated event spaces, that combined instruction with promotion in a way that was elegant in its efficiency. The program would teach you, perhaps, about the correct way to set a table for a formal dinner, and the instructor would use, as her demonstrating materials, products available in the store's china and crystal and silver departments. The lesson and the sales pitch occupied the same afternoon. The learning was real. But so was the commercial dimension, and the commercial dimension was more sophisticated than it might appear, because it was not simply trying to sell you a specific fork. It was trying to sell you a relationship with a specific kind of life, the life where you needed the fork, where the fork was a natural and obvious part of your daily existence rather than a special acquisition. This relationship between etiquette instruction and consumer culture was one of the defining features of the era, and it shaped what etiquette meant in ways that went beyond its original function. Etiquette had begun as a code for navigating inherited social structures, for managing the complex social lives of people who had been born into certain circumstances and needed to understand the conventions of those circumstances. In the post-war American context, it became increasingly a tool for aspiration, a set of instructions for entering a social world that was being actively constructed and marketed rather than simply inherited. The formal dinner party was not just a social occasion. It was a stage set, and the etiquette was the script, and the script was available for purchase. The children learning their fork placement in the 1950s were not only learning a social code, they were being prepared for participation in a consumer economy that had organised a significant portion of itself around the production and sale of the equipment that the social code required. The correctly set table needed specific objects. The correctly maintained appearance needed specific products. The correctly written thank you note needed specific stationery. All of these things were available in abundance in the stores that lined the main streets of American towns and cities, and the etiquette that told you what was correct was also, not coincidentally, telling you what to buy. Awareness of this does not cancel the usefulness of what was taught. The fork was still a useful thing to know about. The thank you note was still a genuine act of consideration. But it does add a dimension to the picture, a dimension that the etiquette books did not tend to acknowledge because the etiquette books were themselves part of the commercial ecosystem. Products sold to produce need for other products. Instruction manuals for a way of life that came with a shopping list attached. Emily Post's estate received royalties. The department stores increased their silver sales. The women's magazines sold advertising from the companies whose products appeared in the photographs that illustrated the etiquette features. It was all connected, and the connection was not hidden exactly, but it was not foregrounded either. What was foregrounded was the ideal itself, the gracious household, the well-managed social occasion, the composed and competent hostess, the well-behaved children who asked to be excused. That ideal was real in the sense that it was genuinely desired, that the people who worked toward it found real satisfaction in achieving it, that the skills it required were real skills, and their exercise produced real pleasure. It was also a construction, built with significant commercial intent, maintained by an industry of advice and instruction and product, and shaped by the particular aspirations of a particular moment in American history that was itself built on assumptions and exclusions that have since become much harder to ignore. The children are still sitting at the table, the forks are still in the correct hands, the napkins are still in the correct laps. The asking to be excused is still coming in a minute, as soon as everyone is finished and it is appropriate to ask. The kitchen smells of whatever was served for dinner, and outside the kitchen window the neighbourhood is doing what it does on a weekday evening, settling into its domestic routines, the particular quiet of a residential street at 6:30 on a Tuesday. And inside the house the table is a model of what was supposed to be, everything in its place, everyone behaving correctly, the world as organised as it was possible for a world to be. Hold that image for a moment, because it is part of the truth of this era. It is not the whole truth, but it is part of it. There was also Lillian Eichler Watson, who was less remembered than Emily Post, but who was, in terms of sheer commercial reach in the 1920s and 30s, at least as significant, possibly more so. Lillian Eichler was a young copywriter, working for a book publishing company when she wrote a book of etiquette as a companion piece to the company's direct mail advertising, a way to fill out the catalogue. The book sold spectacularly, to the considerable surprise of everyone involved, and Lillian Eichler became for a period one of the most widely read etiquette authorities in the country. She later published updated versions under her married name, and those books continued to circulate through the decades that followed. Her approach was more conversational than Emily Post's, slightly less focused on the upper-class social world, slightly more attuned to the concerns of the middle-class reader who was not trying to master the rules of Newport summers, but trying to figure out what to do when a guest arrived unexpectedly and the house was not ready for company. These different voices in the etiquette tradition address different anxieties, and the anxieties themselves are a kind of social history, a record of what people in different decades and different circumstances were worried about getting wrong. In the 1920s, the worry was often about appearing nouveau riche, about the visible seams of recently acquired status. In the Depression era, the worry shifted to doing correctly with less, to maintaining social standards under economic pressure. In the post-war years, the worry was about the speed of the social change, the rapid movement of families into new circumstances that required new social skills, and the etiquette industry was there, reliably, with specific and detailed guidance for every new worry as it arrived. This responsiveness to anxiety is worth noting because it tells you something about what etiquette was actually for, at the level of need rather than the level of ideal. It was for the reduction of uncertainty. It was for the provision of a clear answer in a situation where the correct behaviour was not obvious. It was for the consolation, real and genuine, of knowing that you were doing the right thing even when the right thing was not instinctive. And that consolation was not trivial. In a world that was changing as fast as post-war America was changing, the availability of clear and authoritative guidance on how to behave was a real form of comfort, regardless of the commercial interests that surrounded it. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. Emily Post understood this. It is why her revisions to the book kept pace with the times rather than insisting on a standard that the times had made obsolete. She understood that the function of etiquette was not to preserve a specific set of forms, but to give people tools for managing the ongoing challenge of living together, and that the specific tools needed to change as the circumstances changed. This understanding was what made her work durable in a way that more rigid approaches to etiquette instruction were not. The code was not sacred. The code was in service of something, and the something was what mattered. You arrive early. This is the first rule of your own professional code, the one that exists above all the rules you're about to teach, because arriving early is the only way to make the room yours before the children make it theirs. You carry in a cardboard box that holds, among other things, a folded tablecloth, 4 settings of silverware, 4 plates, 4 glasses, 4 napkins folded into careful triangles, a small ceramic pitcher for demonstration purposes, and a copy of a book you have read so many times that the spine gave up several years ago. You have repaired the spine with white adhesive tape. You have not, however, replaced the book, because this particular copy has your notes in the margins, small, careful notations in pencil, additions and adjustments you have made over the years as the curriculum evolved, and as you learned, from the children, what needed to be said differently. The room fills slowly, the way rooms always fill when the people arriving are not entirely sure they want to arrive. They come in groups of 2 or 3, girls in their school dresses or their Saturday clothes, boys with their hair combed in ways that suggest someone did it for them very recently and under mild protest. They are between the ages of 10 and 14 mostly, which is the age range that was considered ideal for this kind of instruction, old enough to absorb it but young enough that the habits were still being formed. They sit down without being asked, because they have been told to sit down without being asked, or because they have learned from watching other people. This is itself a small etiquette lesson, and you note it without commenting on it. You begin, always, the same way. You stand at the front of the room, your hands at your sides, not clasped in front of you, which looks defensive, and not clasped behind you, which looks like you are hiding something. You make eye contact with the room, not with any specific child, but with the room as a whole, a practice sweep that communicates that you are aware of all of them equally. You say good afternoon, you wait. They say good afternoon back, unevenly, in the overlapping way that groups say things they have been prompted to say. Then you say it again, just those 2 words, good afternoon, and you wait again, and this time they say it together, with more attention, because they have realised, from the way you waited, that there is a correct way to do this too. This is your first teaching of the day, delivered without announcement. The way you said good afternoon, the posture you held, the eye contact you maintained, the way you stood still while they adjusted to the room, all of that was content. All of that was the lesson. You will not point this out for several weeks, if at all. For now, you simply begin. The tablecloth goes on first. You smooth it from the centre outward, which is the correct technique, because smoothing from an edge introduces wrinkles. The children watch. Some of them have seen this before in their own kitchens, and they recognise the gesture, but they have never seen it with this level of attention being paid to it, and that changes what it looks like. You place the first setting, fork on the left, knife on the right with the blade turned inward, spoon to the right of the knife, salad fork to the left of the dinner fork if there is to be a salad course. You say each piece as you place it, not because they cannot see what you're doing, but because naming the object in its correct context is how it enters the memory. Dinner fork, salad fork, dinner knife, teaspoon. Their eyes are tracking your hands. Then you step back and you say, now you know where everything goes, but I'm also going to tell you why. Because a rule that has a reason is something you can remember. A rule that has no reason is something you have to memorize. And there is a difference between those two things, a real and practical difference, and in 10 years you will understand exactly what I mean. This is the part that surprised you the first time you gave this class, which was about 7 years ago in a church hall not very different from this one. You had expected the children to want the rules. You had expected them to be receptive to the authority of the code, to accept the "this is how it is done" in the way that children often accept instructions from adults who are clearly not their parents. What you found instead was that they wanted the why. Not all of them, not always, but enough of them, consistently enough, that you adjusted the curriculum to include it, and the curriculum is better for the adjustment. The fork is on the left because most people are right-handed, you tell them, and you want your dominant hand free for the knife, which does the most active work. The knife blade faces inward toward the plate, because a blade facing outward toward the next person at the table is aggressive, and a well-set table is not aggressive, it is welcoming. The glasses go at the top right because that is where your right hand naturally reaches when you are seated. The napkin goes in your lap because it is there to catch things that fall before they reach your lap, and it cannot catch anything if it is folded on the table beside your plate. There is a reason for everything. Not all the reasons are equally important, but all of them were thought through by someone at some point, and knowing them makes the table feel less like a test and more like a tool. The children who are with you today are of different kinds. There is the one who has been here before, who already knows most of this, and is waiting for the point where you say something new, the small detail that is not in the standard material, the thing you add because you learned it from experience or from someone who had been doing this before you. There is the one who has never eaten at a formally set table, and who is watching your hands with an expression that is trying not to reveal how completely new this is to her. There is the one who is here because a parent insisted, and who has decided before arriving that none of this is interesting, and who will change their mind about that, quietly, in approximately 15 minutes, which is about how long it takes for something to become interesting once you start doing it with your hands, rather than just hearing about it. And there is the one who asks questions. There is always one who asks questions, and they are your favourite, even though you are careful not to let this show, because the question asker is the one who is taking the lesson seriously enough to push on it, to test its edges, to find the places where the reasoning becomes less clear. Today the question asker is a girl with dark braids and a very direct gaze, and her first question is, why does it matter which hand the fork is in, as long as the food gets to your mouth? This is a fair question. It is in fact a very good question. And your answer is one you have refined over 7 years of being asked versions of it. You say, it matters because everyone at the table can see what you are doing, and when what you're doing matches what everyone else is doing, the table becomes a comfortable place. When it does not match, there is a small interruption, a moment of noticing, a flicker of attention directed at the thing that is different. Most of the time, no one says anything, but the noticing happens, and the goal of a well-managed table is that no one should have to notice anything except the conversation and the food. The goal is ease. The rules serve the ease, and the way the rules serve the ease is by making everyone's behaviour legible to everyone else, which is another way of saying everyone knows the same code, and so no one has to think about the code, and because no one is thinking about the code, everyone is free to be present with each other. The girl with the braids considers this. Then she says, so the rules are for other people, not for you. And you say, that is exactly right, and you mean it. You spend the first half of the class on the table because the table is the most teachable surface, the one with the most visible rules and the most demonstrable reasons. The second half you move to the standing and sitting, the entering a room, the introduction of one person to another. These are harder to teach because they require movement, and movement in a room full of children who have been sitting still has its own momentum problems, but you have done this long enough to manage the transition. You demonstrate how to shake hands, pressing your own hand into the air in front of you, showing the angle, the firmness, the accompanying eye contact. You say, when you shake someone's hand, you are telling them several things at once. You are telling them that you see them. You are telling them that your word means something. You are telling them that you are present and engaged and ready to interact as an equal. A handshake is a kind of agreement, made with the body instead of with words. And the quality of that agreement is legible to anyone who receives it. One of the boys in the back has been looking at the window since approximately the middle of this speech, and you let him look, because you have learned that some children process by appearing not to pay attention, and some children who appear to be paying attention are not. You will know which is which when it is time to practice, which is coming shortly. You call everyone to their feet, and you arrange them in pairs, and you have them shake hands with each other while you walk the room, watching, noting, occasionally reaching over to adjust a grip or to say turn your palm slightly, or to remind someone that eye contact is not optional. The boy who is looking at the window shakes hands with a precise measured firmness that suggests he has been watching very carefully indeed. You say nothing, but you make a note to give him something harder next class. The introductions are the most theatrical part of the curriculum, in the sense that they require the most performance, the most active attention to social choreography. You introduce yourself to a child using the formula, and then you have them introduce you to another child using the same formula, and then you have them introduce two children who have never met to each other using the same formula. The formula is simple. It names the people in the correct order, which depends on their relative status or age, and it offers a small bridge of context, something that gives the two people being introduced a place to begin a conversation. This is the introduction as a social gift, the thing the introducer gives to both parties, the small act of facilitating connection that is, in Emily Post's framing, one of the most genuinely useful social skills a person can have. By the end of the session, the room has a different quality than it had at the beginning. Not dramatic, not transformed, but different. The children are aware of themselves in a way they were not 2 hours ago, aware of their hands and their posture, and the specific geometry of their relation to the other people in the room. They are, in a small but real way, more deliberate. And that deliberateness is what you are paid to produce, which sounds cold when you say it that way, but is actually, you've come to believe, one of the more genuinely useful things you can give a 10-year-old. The knowledge that they have the power to make a room easier for everyone in it, that their body and their speech and their attention are not accidents but instruments, and that learning to play those instruments well is work that will pay them back in ways they cannot yet fully anticipate. You pack up the tablecloth and the silverware and the plates, folding everything carefully back into the box. The children have mostly left, some of them saying goodbye in the new way, the slightly more deliberate way, that tells you the afternoon has done what it was supposed to do. The girl with the braids is the last to leave. She pauses at the door and says, "Next time, can you teach us about the other forks?" You tell her yes. She leaves. You finish packing your box. The room goes back to being a church hall or a back room or a gymnasium, whichever it is, and you carry your box out to the car and you drive home through the late afternoon, past houses where families are beginning the ritual of dinner, and you think about what you will say next Tuesday, and whether the part about the fish fork is better before or after the part about the individual butter spreader, which is its own small lesson in the very particular pleasures of knowing more than you are expected to know. There is satisfaction in this work, and it is not the simple satisfaction of having delivered information. Information is the least of it. The satisfaction is in the moment when something clicks, when a child who arrived believing that all of this was arbitrary and somewhat ridiculous suddenly understands that the arbitrary rules are sitting on top of a real thing, a genuine effort to make the shared spaces of human life more navigable and more kind. That understanding, which comes at different moments for different children and sometimes never comes at all, is what you're actually teaching. Everything else is just forks. The weeks that follow have their own rhythm, and you learn to read it. The first class is always the hardest because you're also being evaluated, not formally, not on paper, but in the way children evaluate all authority figures, with a quick and unsentimental assessment of whether you know what you're talking about and whether knowing what you're talking about seems to be worth anything to you. You pass this evaluation most of the time. You know when you have not, because the room has a quality of polite inattention that is worse than open resistance, and you go home on those Tuesdays and you think about what you did differently and you adjust. The middle classes are your favourite. By the third or fourth session, the children have accepted the premise enough to engage with it, and the engagement produces interesting things. The child who has gone home and practiced setting the table and has discovered a fork they did not know was in the drawer. The child who has tried the handshake on a relative and been complimented on it and is now mildly interested in what else might earn them that response. The child who has begun to notice, in the world around them, the ways in which people do and do not follow the codes you have been discussing, and who brings these observations back to class with the specific pleasure of someone who has acquired a new way of seeing. This is the part they do not put in the curriculum guides, the observation part, the looking at the world with new attention part. You did not plan for it exactly, but it happens reliably around the third or fourth session, and when it does, you think about why it happens, and you think it is because the rules, once you know them, become a kind of lens. They do not just tell you what to do, they tell you what to look at. And looking carefully at the specific ways human beings navigate their shared spaces is something that turns out to be interesting to almost everyone, children included. The last class always includes a practice meal, which is the part the children have been anticipating and dreading in approximately equal measure since the beginning. You set the table with the full service, all the forks and spoons and plates and glasses, and you serve a simple meal, always the same simple meal, soup and a bread roll and a small dessert, and the children eat it while you walk the room and watch. Not critically, not in a way that makes them feel scrutinized, but attentively, in the way that someone watches a piece of work they have invested in. You note what has been learned and what has not. You note who remembers the napkin and who forgets. You note whose hand instinctively goes to the correct fork. You note, with particular satisfaction, the moment when the child who arrived 8 weeks ago, convinced that none of this was interesting, is now demonstrating the correct bread roll technique, tearing rather than cutting, buttering one small piece at a time, with the relaxed ease of someone who has done this often enough that it no longer requires conscious attention. That is the goal. Not conscious effort, unconscious ease. The rule so thoroughly learned that it disappears into the body, and what remains is not the rule, but the grace it was designed to produce. You have seen it happen enough times to believe in it. You have seen children who arrived restless and resistant leave the last class with a something, a quality of attention to their own physicality that was not there before, and you have occasionally, years later, encountered one of those children, now grown, in a restaurant or at a church gathering, and watched them move through a social situation with a particular ease, a kind of comfortable literacy in the language the room was speaking, and thought, there it is. There is the thing. The pay is not substantial. It never has been. Women who teach things like this in the 1950s are paid in the way that women who do useful work in the 1950s are often paid, which is with modest fees and with gratitude and with the understanding that this is supplementary work done alongside the primary work of being a wife and a mother and a member of the community, not work that stands on its own as a career. You have feelings about this that you do not express, partly because expressing them would serve no practical purpose, and partly because the category of feelings that cannot be practically addressed has its own etiquette, which is the etiquette of graceful containment. You do the work, you are good at the work, you continue. And on Tuesday afternoons, when the room fills with children who have been brought here by parents who understand that something about the way the world works is being communicated through the table setting, and the handshake and the asking to be excused, you stand at the front of the room with your hands at your sides and you say good afternoon, and you wait, and they say it back. There are things about this work that you have never quite been able to explain to people who have not done it. The first is the physical dimension of it, which is more substantial than it appears. You're on your feet for the entire class, moving through the room, demonstrating, watching, adjusting. Your posture is always demonstrative. You're always showing something, even when you're not consciously performing. Your body is the text. The way you hold yourself is itself the lesson, and you cannot set it down for the duration of the class the way you might set down a book. You pick up your things at the beginning, and you do not put them down until you walk out the door. You have thought, occasionally, about what this costs you in energy and what it builds in you in return. The sustained physical awareness, the the continuous monitoring of your own presentation is exhausting in the way that performing always is, even when the performance is genuine, even when what you are presenting is what you actually are rather than something you are pretending to be. By the end of a long Tuesday afternoon, you are tired in a specific way, a way that is different from ordinary tiredness, a way that is connected to having been observed continuously for several hours, not judged exactly. Children are not especially sophisticated judges of adult posture, but observed, and being observed with any consistency changes something about how you hold yourself, makes you more aware of the choices that are usually unconscious, brings the automated up to the surface. The second thing that is hard to explain is the relationship you develop with a curriculum over years of teaching it. The curriculum you inherited, which was organised around Emily Post and a few companion texts and the practical wisdom of the woman who taught you, has become something slightly different in your hands. Not unrecognisable, the bones are the same, the fork placement is the same, the principles are the same. But the way you tell it has changed slowly, session by session, in response to the specific questions that specific children have asked and the specific confusions that specific moments have revealed. The curriculum is living, in the sense that it has adapted over time, and it carries in its current form the traces of every session you have taught, every child who asked a question that sent you back to rethink something you had been presenting too simply. This is what you think about when you read the Etiquette books, the official ones, the revised Emily Posts and the Lillian Eichlers and the Amy Vanderbilts, whose book came out in 1952 and became its own substantial authority. You read them as colleagues, people who have been teaching the same subject and have made different decisions about how to present it. You agree with some of their decisions and disagree with others, and the disagreements are the interesting part because the disagreements are where your own understanding of what this is all about comes into focus. Amy Vanderbilt, who arrived after Emily Post and who addressed herself somewhat more directly to the practical concerns of the non-aristocratic household, had a slightly different relationship to the rules than Post did. Vanderbilt was more willing to say that a rule could be bent if bending it served the underlying purpose better than following it would. This flexibility appealed to you, though you did not teach it explicitly, because teaching children that rules could be bent before they had thoroughly learned the rules was a recipe for a particular kind of chaos that a church hall on a Tuesday afternoon could not easily accommodate. But the flexibility was there in how you thought about it, in the quiet decisions you made about what to push and what to let go, about which corrections were essential and which were refinements for a later session. The corrections you made were not always about the technical rule. Sometimes the correction was about the spirit. There was a boy, 2 classes ago, who was technically doing everything correctly, but who was doing it with a kind of aggressive precision that communicated something different from what the rules were supposed to communicate. He set his fork down between bites exactly as you had demonstrated, but the gesture was sharp, almost contemptuous, the fork placed with a little more force than necessary. He sat straight, but the straightness was rigid, not composed. He said please and thank you, but the words came out of a face that was doing something other than what the words were saying. You watched this for a session and a half before you said anything. When you said something, you said it quietly at the end of class when the others had mostly gone. You said, "You know all the rules, that is clear. Now I want you to think about what they are for. Not what they are for." He looked at you for a moment. Then he said, "So people are comfortable?" And you said, "Exactly right. So how do you know if they are comfortable?" He thought about it. He said, "They seem relaxed." And you said, "So what does that mean for how you hold yourself?" He was quiet. Then he said, "I am doing it too tight." And you said, "Yes, you're doing it too tight." He came back the following week, and the sharpness was gone from the gesture, still precise but no longer aggressive, and you did not mention it again because it did not need to be mentioned again. That is the teaching that does not appear in the curriculum guides. The teaching about why the rule exists, at the level deep enough to correct not the rule itself, but the spirit in which it is being performed. You cannot teach that to a room of 40 children simultaneously. You can only teach it to one child at a time, in the specific moment when that child is ready to receive it, which is the moment when they have already learned the rule thoroughly enough that the spirit of it is the next thing to address. It requires patience and it requires paying attention, and the paying attention is the part that makes this more than just instruction in fork placement. The girls present different challenges than the boys, not better or worse, different in kind. The challenge with many of the girls is not resistance but excess. The over-application of the rules in ways that produce the same tightness you corrected in the boy, but for different reasons. Girls in the 1950s are absorbing a message from many directions simultaneously about how much their appearance matters, how much their behaviour matters, how much is riding on the impression they make, and some of them arrive at the etiquette class already carrying that message in their bodies in a way that is too heavy for 10 years old. They sit too still. They're too careful. They correct themselves before you have had a chance to see the error, which means they are monitoring themselves even while they are supposed to be engaged in the lesson. You handle this gently because the message they are carrying is not something you gave them, and it is not something you can take away from them in a Tuesday afternoon class. What you can do is model something different. You can demonstrate through your own ease in the room that knowing the rules does not require being tense about the rules, that the goal is not the performance of knowledge, but the ease that comes after knowledge, when the knowledge has sunk deep enough that you do not have to think about it anymore. You can tell them, as directly as the setting allows, that the point of all of this is not to be careful. The point is to be free. Not every child hears that. Some of them hear the rules and not the permission that comes after the rules, but some of them hear it. The girl with the braids who asked about the other forks, the quiet boy in the third row who has been absorbing everything with an attention that suggests he is building something rather than just learning something. They hear the permission and they take it, and that is the session you carry home with you when you drive back through the neighbourhood at dusk, the street settling into its evening routines. The sense that something was done correctly today, even if you could not say precisely what. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. There is a long tradition behind this work that you did not invent and will not end. Women have been teaching other people's children manners for as long as there have been manners to teach, and the forms of the teaching have changed, and the content has changed, and the settings have changed, but the fundamental transaction has not. One person who has absorbed a social code thoroughly enough to transmit it, standing in front of people who have not yet absorbed it, and providing the transmission. The formality varies, the compensation varies, the cultural weight of the code varies, but the work is recognizable across all of it, and there is something about recognizing it, about understanding that you are part of a long line of women who stood in front of rooms and said, "Here is the fork, and here is where it goes," that gives the Tuesday afternoon a weight that it would not have without that recognition. You are not improvising, you are continuing something. What you will leave behind is harder to describe. Not the curriculum, which will be taught by someone else after you. Not the specific children, who will carry what they learned here into lives that will make very little reference to where they learned it. What you will leave behind is something more diffuse, something that spreads through the culture the way all teaching spreads, through the specific adjustments it makes to the specific people it touches, who then go out into the world and interact with other people in ways that have been slightly changed by the teaching. And those people interact with others, and the ripple spreads outward and loses its shape but does not disappear entirely. You set a table once in front of a child and explained why the knife blade faces inward. That child is now 35 or 40 years old and setting tables for their own children, and whether they remember the explanation or not, whether they could trace the practice back to a Tuesday afternoon in a church hall or a school gymnasium, the practice is there. The blade faces inward. Someone taught them that. You. Take a moment with that, with the room, with the teacher, with the children learning which fork is which and why it matters. Because what comes next belongs to the same world, and it is the part that the curriculum guides left out. The etiquette that American children learned in the 1950s was presented as universal. Here is how people behave. Here is the correct way to set a table and shake a hand and write a thank you note and address an elder. The word correct was used comfortably and often, with the implication that it referred to a standard that existed the way gravity exists, independently of anyone's opinion about it, just there, waiting to be discovered and followed. This was, in the most polite possible terms, not quite the whole story. The code that was being taught was not a universal human code. It was a specific cultural code, drawn from specific Anglo-American upper-class traditions, filtered through the particular social moment of mid-century America, shaped by the ambitions and anxieties of a specific stratum of society, and it worked very well for some people and functioned for others as something closer to a test they had not been given the preparation materials for. The gap between these two groups is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of the great etiquette project of the 1950s, and it is worth spending some time with it because it changes what the whole enterprise looks like. To understand who the code was for, you have to understand who wrote it. Emily Post wrote from inside a particular social world, and that world was overwhelmingly white, Protestant, and financially comfortable, at minimum, and in many cases considerably more than that. The manners she described, the specific forms of address and the specific equipment at the table, and the specific architecture of the social occasion reflected that world's understanding of itself as the world, not a world, the world. The standard from which other worlds departed and toward which other worlds might, with sufficient effort and instruction, aspire. This was the premise underneath the premise. Etiquette was presented as the path to social ease and social inclusion, and it was, but inclusion in what, exactly, an ease in which rooms, and for whom? These were questions that the etiquette books did not tend to address directly. The code that got children to the right fork at the right time was the same code that told certain people, in certain rooms, that they did not belong there, not in those words, not in any words at all, which was its own kind of precision. The message was delivered through the shared fluency of the people who had been raised with the code and the visible, quiet difficulty of those who had not. The families who had recently arrived, who were still in the process of becoming American, in the particular way that becoming American required in the post-war years, understood this. They understood it in the specific bodily way that you understand something when the consequences of not understanding it follow you into every room. Immigrant families, working-class families, families whose domestic traditions were organized around entirely different codes, with their own logic and their own beauty and their own capacity to produce human beings of genuine grace and consideration. These families encountered the 1950s etiquette project as something that was simultaneously an invitation and a judgment. Come in, it said, but first be different from what you are. The department store etiquette courses that were offered in this era sometimes made this dynamic uncomfortably legible. The image they were selling, the well-dressed woman with the correct fork and the confident, easy manner, was a specific kind of woman, and the specificity was not accidental. The photographs in the instructional materials were consistently of women who looked a certain way, dressed a certain way, moved in certain spaces. The lesson was not only about the fork, the lesson was also about who was holding it and what kind of woman she was supposed to be, and for some of the women attending those courses, the gap between themselves and that image was not a gap that fork placement could close. Race was present in this dynamic in ways that were, in the 1950s, rarely discussed openly but were completely visible to anyone paying attention. The schools where etiquette was formally taught, the church programs, the civic organization curricula, the YWCA classes, these were in most parts of the country segregated by law or by powerful social custom. Black children were learning etiquette too, often in very deliberate and sophisticated ways, often precisely because their communities understood that mastery of the dominant code was a form of armor in a society that was looking for reasons to exclude them. But they were learning it in different rooms, often from different teachers, and the context in which they were learning it was different in ways that matter. The etiquette of the black middle class in the post-war years was a complex and thoughtful thing, shaped by what historians have sometimes called the politics of respectability, the understanding that in a society organized around the systematic devaluation of black life, exemplary behavior was one of the tools available for claiming visibility and dignity. The fork placement and the firm handshake and the thank you note were not just social skills in this context, they were arguments, they were claims about the humanity and the sophistication and the worthiness of a community that the dominant culture was consistently denying those qualities to. The etiquette instruction happening in black churches and community organizations and schools in the 1950s was, in this sense, doing something more politically serious than the etiquette instruction happening in white church halls and department stores, even when it was teaching the same forks. This is not a distinction that the etiquette books acknowledged, because the etiquette books, written from inside the dominant culture, did not tend to acknowledge the political dimensions of what they were doing. Emily Post wrote about consideration for others. She wrote about making everyone at the table comfortable. She did not write about the fact that the table she was describing was not equally available to everyone, that the comfort she was trying to produce was a comfort organised around the presence of some people and the absence of others, and that the rules she was articulating were embedded in a social structure that the rules themselves helped to maintain. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the 1950s Etiquette project, and it is the thing that the cheerful magazine spreads, and the classroom diagrams and the warm church hall afternoons with the folded tablecloth and the borrowed plates were not designed to make legible. The code was not arbitrary, it was not neutral. It was a system, and like all systems, it operated in someone's interest, and the interests it served best were the interests of the people who had built it. There is also a gender dimension to this that is worth examining, and it is closely related to everything else. The etiquette instruction that girls received in the 1950s was more intensive, more physical, more focused on the body as a social object, and more consequential than the instruction that boys received. This was not accidental. Girls were being trained for a specific social role, the role of the woman who manages the social space, who sets the table and writes the thank you note and ensures that guests are comfortable and that the household presents correctly to the outside world. Boys were being trained to move through that space as participants. Girls were being trained to create and maintain it. The labour of social maintenance that fell to women was enormous and was not acknowledged as labour in any of the etiquette books. When Emily Post described a well-run household, she was describing a considerable amount of work done by a woman who was also expected to look effortless while doing it. The perfectly set table required someone to set it. The correctly worded thank you note required someone to write it. The smooth management of a dinner party, the seating arrangements and the timing of the courses, and the conversation steered away from dangerous territory and toward comfortable ground, required someone to execute it with the invisible precision of someone who had practiced a great deal and was not going to let that practice show. The etiquette books told women how to do all of this. They did not tend to ask whether all of this was what women wanted to be doing. The children in the church hall learning their fork placement were absorbing something that went beyond table manners. They were absorbing a map of the social world and their place in it. For the boys, the map suggested mobility, the ability to move between spaces and be welcomed because they knew the code. For the girls, the map suggested responsibility, the specific responsibility of maintaining the spaces that others move through. Neither group had asked for the map they received. It was given to them, with the best intentions, by people who genuinely believed that knowing these things would make their lives better, and in many cases it did, and in many cases it did something more complicated than that. Something that took years to understand, something that some people are still, if they are being honest, in the middle of sorting out. The Etiquette project of the 1950s was a genuine attempt to create a shared code that would make American social life more navigable and more humane. In its best moments, it did exactly that. In its less examined moments, it reproduced and reinforced the inequalities it moved through, the racial hierarchies, the gender expectations, the class assumptions. It was, like most human projects of that scope and ambition, both better and worse than it believed itself to be. And the children who learned to ask to be excused from the table, who learned to write thank you notes within the week, who learned to stand when an adult entered the room, those children were doing something real. They were learning a code that would serve them in specific contexts, give them access to specific rooms, and confer on them a specific kind of social legibility. What the code cost them, what it asked them to set aside or conform to or ignore, that was the part that nobody was quite willing to put in the curriculum. The table in the church hall is being packed away now. The tablecloth is folded, the silverware wrapped, the plates stacked carefully back into the cardboard box. The children have gone home. The room is going back to being itself. And outside, in the afternoon that is tipping toward evening, in the houses up and down the street where dinner is beginning to announce itself through kitchen windows, children who have been taught to set the table are setting it. They are placing the fork on the left and the knife on the right with the blade turned inward and the napkin beside the plate in its triangle. They are not thinking about any of this. They have thought about it enough times that they no longer have to, and in this, they have become what the whole project intended them to become. People for whom the correct behaviour is simply the behaviour that comes. Whether that is a gift or a constraint or both at once depends on who you were when they started teaching you, and what you were being taught the fork placement was for. It depends on the room the table was in, and whose dinner table it was, and who was expected to set it, and who was expected to sit down to it as though someone else having done the setting was simply how the world worked. Those distinctions mattered then, and they matter still, even now, even when the church halls have been converted to other uses, and the tablecloths are different and the forks are fewer, and the rules about who sits where have shifted considerably from where they stood in 1953. What has not shifted is the underlying thing, the reason the rules existed in the first place, underneath all the other reasons, the social and the political and the commercial. The reason was that shared space is hard, that living with other people, eating with them, working beside them, navigating the ordinary collisions of daily life in proximity is genuinely difficult, and that people have always looked for ways to reduce the friction. The Etiquette project was one of those ways. It was imperfect, it was inequitable in its distribution and in its assumptions. But it was also, at its root, an attempt to take that shared difficulty seriously, to say that the way we treat each other in the ordinary moments, the passing of the salt and the writing of the thank you note, and the standing when someone enters the room, adds up to something, that it constitutes a kind of ongoing argument about who we think we are to each other. And children, sitting at tables with their forks in the correct hand, learning to ask to be excused, were being made participants in that argument. Not always on the most favourable terms, but participants nonetheless, and that, for all its complications, is not nothing. The gender dynamics of the Etiquette project deserve considerably more attention than the Tuesday afternoon class was ever going to give them, and they are, in retrospect, one of the most significant things the whole enterprise was quietly doing. When you look at the actual distribution of etiquette instruction in the 1950s, in terms of who was being taught what and to what depth and with what ultimate purpose, the gendered structure of the whole system becomes very clear very quickly. Women were the primary target of etiquette instruction, and they were the primary consumers of etiquette guidance in all its forms: the books, the columns, the classes, the magazine features. They were also, not coincidentally, the primary practitioners of the social labour that the etiquette system governed. The table setting and the thank you note writing and the guest management, and the hospitality provisioning that kept the social world running. The men in the etiquette books were subjects of instruction in the sense that they too had rules to follow. But the architecture of the social occasion, the invisible infrastructure of the dinner party, and the birthday gathering and the neighbourhood coffee, was assumed to be women's responsibility, and the instruction was aimed accordingly. This meant that women were being trained, through the etiquette system, for a form of labour that was not called labour. It was called hospitality, it was called gracious living, it was called having a lovely home and being a wonderful hostess and making everyone feel so comfortable and welcome. The words that were used to describe it did not have the weight of work attached to them, and the absence of that weight was itself a form of concealment, a way of making the labour invisible by describing it in terms that suggested ease and natural talent, rather than effort and skill. The effort was real, the skill was real. The woman who could manage a dinner party for 12, who had planned the menu and done the shopping and prepared the food, and set the table correctly, and seated the guests according to the complex social mathematics of who should be near whom and away from whom, and managed the conversation across 3 courses and cleared gracefully and served the dessert, and maintained her composure and her conversation and her appearance throughout, that woman was doing something that required genuine competence and considerable energy. The etiquette books told her how to do it. They did not, with any consistency, call it work. They called it the art of gracious living, which sounded like a pleasure and not a job. The pleasure was real too. This is the complexity that is easy to lose when you look at this from the outside. Many women in the 1950s genuinely enjoyed the social labour they were performing. The planning of a well-managed occasion, the satisfaction of a table beautifully set, the specific pleasure of watching guests move comfortably through a space you had prepared for them. These were genuine satisfactions, not performances of satisfaction or compensations for disappointment. The work was sometimes pleasant, sometimes more than pleasant. The problem was not that women were doing it. The problem was that the system did not acknowledge that they were doing it, did not treat it as something that had value in the way that paid work had value, did not ask whether the distribution of this labour was equitable, did not consider that some of the women performing it might have preferred to be performing something else, or at least to be acknowledged for the performance they were giving. The thank you notes reveal this most cleanly. In the 1950s American household, thank you notes were written by women. This was almost universal. When a couple attended a dinner party, the wife wrote the thank you note to the wife of the hosting couple. When a family received a gift, the mother wrote the thank you note, or oversaw its writing, or helped the children write theirs. The men in these households were not writing thank you notes. They were not being trained to write them. The training for that specific form of social labour was aimed entirely at women and girls, and it was embedded in a larger system that assigned the maintenance of social relationships to women as their particular domain and their particular responsibility, a responsibility that required skill and effort, but that came with neither recognition nor compensation. The etiquette books did not frame it as an assignment. They framed it as a natural inclination, as something that women were suited for by temperament and by the specific attunement to social relationships that was, in this era, considered a defining feature of femininity. This framing was comfortable because it made the labour feel like an expression of self rather than a demand made by others, and an expression of self does not require acknowledgement the way a demand does because you wanted to do it after all. The etiquette system in this way was a particularly elegant form of labour extraction, because it trained women to perform social labour and also trained them to understand that performance as self-expression. The cost of that arrangement fell on the women, and it fell quietly, in the specific way that costs fall when no one is keeping track of them. This is not the whole story. Nothing about this era is the whole story in any direction. There were women who resisted the assignment, who found ways to minimise their participation in the social labour apparatus, or to negotiate its distribution with their husbands in ways that were more equitable than the official script suggested. There were women who performed the labour with full awareness that it was labour, and who were clear-eyed about the terms of the arrangement, even when they could not or chose not to change it. There were women who found, within the constraints of the social role they had been given, a genuine domain of competence and authority. The social world as their world, the table as their territory, the management of the occasion as a form of power that was real even when it was unacknowledged. That power was real. The woman who controlled the social life of a household had influence over the relationships that sustained the family's position in the community, over the alliances that shaped her husband's career prospects, over the impressions that determined whether the family was considered good people or not in the dense social accounting of the neighbourhood. She was not without power, she was without acknowledgement of the power she had, which is a different thing and which has its own particular cost. The children absorbing all of this alongside the fork placement rules were getting a map of the social world that included, implicitly, a map of who was responsible for what in that world. The girls were learning that they would be the thank you note writers and the table setters and the guest welcomers and the conversation managers and the social memory of every household they inhabited. The boys were learning that they would move through social occasions that had been prepared for them, that the ease they experienced at a well-managed dinner party was the product of labour that they had not performed and would not be expected to perform. Neither group was told any of this explicitly, but both groups absorbed it, through the specific form of instruction each received and the specific expectations attached to that instruction. The girls who grew up to question those expectations, who looked at the assignment they had been given and found it inadequate or inequitable or simply not what they had signed up for, found that the renegotiation was more complicated than they had expected, partly because the assignment had been framed as self-expression, and partly because the skills they had developed in service of the assignment were genuinely useful, and they did not want to give them up. They just wanted the terms of their deployment to be different. The thank you note was a good thing to know how to write. The gracious management of a social occasion was a genuine skill. The question was, who wrote the notes, and who managed the occasions, and whether the people doing those things were acknowledged for doing them, and whether they had chosen to do them, or had been trained into the choice so early that choice was no longer the right word for it. These are questions that the etiquette books did not address, because the etiquette books were written for the world as it was, not for the world it might become. Emily Post revised her book to accommodate new silverware and new social occasions and new household technologies. She did not revise it to redistribute the labour. That revision happened elsewhere, slowly, over decades, not in any single book, but in the accumulated decisions of individual women in individual households renegotiating the terms of what they had been given. The children in the church hall learning their forks were at the beginning of that long renegotiation, though none of them could have known it. The girl with the braids asking about the other forks, the boy correcting his grip on the handshake, the quiet child in the third row building something out of the material being offered. All of them were taking in a code that they would spend the rest of their lives in some relationship with, accepting and resisting and adapting and passing on in forms that would have been recognisable to the woman with the borrowed tablecloth and unrecognisable to her at the same time. The table endures, the forks change positions across the decades, become fewer, become less formal, become optional in some households and essential in others. But the underlying project, the attempt to make shared meals a form of attention and care, a way of saying to the people sitting with you that you considered them worth preparing for, continues. It continues in every household that sets the table with some intention rather than none, in every family that sits down together and takes a moment before eating, in every child who has been taught that the way you begin a meal says something about how you regard the occasion and the people you are sharing it with. The specific rules of the 1950s have mostly relaxed. The spirit that was behind them, the spirit that Emily Post kept gesturing toward even when the rules she was articulating were more specific than spirit required, that is still there, in the morning kitchens and the evening dinner tables, in the small daily acts of attention that constitute a life lived in consideration of other people. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. That is what was being taught on the Tuesday afternoons. That is what the children were carrying home in their bodies. The fork was the vehicle. The lesson was something else entirely. And with that, we have come to the end of tonight's journey. We have spent the evening inside a world that was organised, in its particulars, around the proposition that behaviour was teachable, that the body could be trained into grace, that the small daily acts of social attention added up to something larger than the moments they occupied. We have been inside the 1950s morning, with the elbow at the edge of the table and the fork in the correct hand, and the specific quiet exhaustion of a child learning over and over again what was expected. We have spent time with Emily Post, who turned a specific social world self-understanding into a national conversation about how Americans ought to treat each other, and who did it with enough practical wisdom that the conversation is still going on. We have stood at the front of the church hall in the warm, slightly wrong kind of chair, with the borrowed table and the folded tablecloth, and tried to explain to a room full of children why the fork matters and what the fork is actually for. And we have looked, as carefully as we could, at what the whole project was quietly doing underneath its official purpose, who it served, who it burdened, what it reproduced without quite meaning to. The thread that connects all four of these stories is something that the etiquette books understood but rarely said directly. Human beings in shared space are always, whether they know it or not, communicating with their bodies. The way you hold yourself at a table, the way you wait for others before you begin, the way you acknowledge someone who walks into the room. These are not trivial gestures, they are small arguments about what other people are worth. And the children who were taught to make those arguments carefully, to make them with attention and with consistency, were being given something that their parents and grandparents believed was genuinely valuable. The knowledge that other people notice you, and that you notice them, and that this noticing is the beginning of something, some form of recognition that makes shared life possible. That is not the whole story. The whole story includes the ways the code was used to exclude, the ways it served the interests of those who had written it, the ways it asked certain people to set themselves aside in order to become legible to a system that had not been designed with them in mind. Those things are true and they matter, and they deserve to be part of how we understand what this era was doing when it stood a child in front of a table and said, "Here is the fork, and here is where it goes, and here is why." But the recognition at the centre of it, the idea that how you move through the world with other people in it is something you can learn to do with more care and more attention and more genuine consideration for the people sharing the space. That recognition is not wrong. It is not reducible to its misuses. The children sitting at the breakfast table on a Saturday morning in 1953, learning to wait before they began eating, learning to ask to be excused, learning to look at the adult who was speaking to them and to hold their body in a way that communicated attention and respect. Those children were being handed something real, even if the hand that gave it was also sometimes the hand that closed certain doors. There is a woman somewhere in the long record of this era who set a table every night that her family ate at home. She set it correctly, always, because the setting had become part of how she understood what a meal was, what it meant for a family to sit down together and share food and share time and come back to each other after the day had scattered them. The tablecloth went on first, the forks on the left, the napkins folded, the glasses placed. She had been taught all of this, as a girl, in a kitchen that smelled of gas and coffee and something baking, and she had taught it in turn, patiently, consistently, without drama, to the children who sat at her table and complained that the fork placement was arbitrary. She would have told them, everything worth learning feels arbitrary at the beginning. Give it time, give it enough repetitions that your hands know where to go without being told, and then, when your hands know, look up. Look at the people sitting with you. Because that is what the table is actually for, not the forks. The people, always the people. The forks are just how you get there. Tonight, wherever you are, however you are placed in the space you're resting in, there is something to be said for the quiet, ordinary care that was put into the world you came from, into the small, persistent attempts of people who lived before you to make shared life a little less difficult. They did not always succeed. They did not always try the right way, but the trying itself, patient and imperfect and continuous, is something. It is the ongoing human argument that other people matter, made visible in the placement of a fork and the writing of a note and the standing up when someone enters the room. Let that settle. Let the kitchen quiet down, let the fork rest where it belongs, and let yourself rest too, in the warmth of a world that tried, in its complicated and imperfect way, to teach its children how to be present with each other. That is enough. That is more than enough. Good night. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.